I'm here this morning to share with you our lessons learned and the outcomes thereof with respect to the Special Diabetes Program for Indians. And it has two major arms. One is the reduction of CVD risk, which is the greatest complication for diabetes among Indian and Native people. And the second arm, the one that focused this morning, has to do with preventing onset of diabetes among those who are pre-diabetic, exactly as David indicated. And please, I'll ask you to remember everything he said, because in parallel, it's highly informative. Let's see, which is... Okay, how's it go forward? There we go. Let me just a little bit of background. First off, is that among American Indian and Alaska Natives in the United States, among the highest prevalence of diabetes as well as incidence. It's just 17% today. That is nearly double that, in fact more than double that among their white non-Hispanic counterparts in the United States. I mentioned that cardiovascular disease is the most serious complication of that. In the context of this particular effort, we conducted a cost of care study in which it would determine that 11% of American Indian patients served by the largest medical facility in the Indian Health Service who are diabetic, and they consumed nearly 37% of the total healthcare expenditures in that particular facility. In terms of developing partnerships, recognizing the epidemic proportion of diabetes in Indian and Native communities, the U.S. Congress, through the efforts of a number of important Native advocacy groups, in 1997, as a part of the Balanced Budget Act, initiated the funding of the Special Diabetes Program for Indians. It began in about $50 million in that first year, and ultimately by 2002 was $100 million a year. And it was focusing on getting out to as many as possible of the 550 tribal communities across the country, federally recognized tribes specifically, to accomplish several things. It was one, to move the readiness of these communities to recognizing that diabetes is a problem. Secondly, beginning to mobilize key stakeholders in those communities and elevate that recognition of a problem to systematic discourse in the community about the nature of those concerns and the things that may be done, and to begin to till the soil and introduce some of the community-wide activities that might be undertaken with respect to preventing diabetes more broadly. Hence things like Just Move It and other kinds of programs found root in that work in the early part of the 1990s. I'll get this sooner or later. Congress was very pleased with the progress in that particular effort. There, in fact, was enormous evidence that Indian and Native communities had moved forward in terms of recognizing the problem, beginning to mobilize themselves around it, galvanizing key stakeholders, and beginning to attempt to address this issue, albeit in relatively rudimentary ways, given the lack of knowledge and information about how we might pursue evidence-based practices at that point in time. Fortunately, as David noted, the NIDDK-sponsored diabetes prevention program, the efficacy trial that had two arms to it, notably the lifestyle balanced curriculum, which focused, it had some very specific goals with respect to weight loss and exercise increase and change in dietary patterns, had been completed. In fact, was completed early because of its early demonstration of success. Congress mandated that they would continue to fund this broader initiative in Indian and Native communities at $125 million a year approximately. And they said, but we want now to have these communities move forward into a more evidence-based approach that we can get a better handle on what our return on investment would be and can be if we move forward to institutionalize such efforts based upon evidence available at that point in time. So in the 2002 reauthorization, they funded something called the SDPI demonstration projects. Again, two arms to them. I'll only be talking about the diabetes prevention arm today. And you can see here the key elements of it that I'll come back to in a moment. The timeline for this was then we became responsible here at the University of Colorado for orchestrating both all of the program development side as well as the formal evaluation. It began in 2003 when we crafted a request for applications that went out across Indian and Native communities nationwide, soliciting proposals to engage and undertake the implementation and evaluation and ultimately the institutionalization of the original anti-DDK lifestyle balance curriculum. We were able to do that in consultation with many of the tribal communities that we've been working with in the previous 5 years, with that groundwork had begun. With the Indian Health Service, we crafted the application itself based upon that input. We involved a number of different key stakeholders from across the country in that regard. We actually held the review right here in this room. There were 130 applications to each of the different arms from across Indian country. One of the interesting things is that Indian and Native communities, the notion of competing against one another is absolutely a culturally sacrosanct thing not to violate. So we had a major challenge in figuring out how to frame this particular effort so as to move past that early anticipated barrier, and we were successful in doing so. Then we moved into a full 14-month planning year. Talk briefly about that. That shifted then into implementation for over 2005 to 2010. 2010, program was demonstrated successful. We went into institutionalization, and now we're about to embark on dissemination to the hundreds of other tribal communities that did not have an opportunity to participate in it. Just to give you a sense with respect to the outcome of the request for applications, there were 36, all represented by red flags here in pins. Grantees awarded across the country. Since many of them were in consortia arrangements, there are 94 different tribal communities across the country that were funded and have been funded to date in this undertaking. In terms of agenda setting, the agenda was already set for us in large part because Congress mandated that we embrace and move forward with an evidence-based practice, specifically that NIDDK DPP lifestyle balance intervention, which had these particular features to it. The question was, of course, though it was proven effective in very specific segments of our community, would it be so in Indian and Native communities? Now, as a parenthetical note, in the original efficacy study, there were 3 tribal communities that participated, that 161 participants out of a little over 3,000 participants. So we had an opportunity to, an early indication of some of the lessons learned from that, but the outcome data were basically so small that we couldn't learn much from that. So just to note, David anticipated a little bit, the DPP, our goal was to screen Indian and Native people who were pre-diabetic, as David noted, to recruit and enroll eligible participants, to engage them in the 16-session DPP lifestyle balance curriculum, to complement that with individual lifestyle coaching sessions and physical activity programs, build a retention and aftercore that would keep them engaged post-prevention, and to continue to enrich and enhance and support the community activities that were intended to support the gains through the actual intervention. It was really stunning to see the level of creativity and innovation that all of these communities brought to bear. In developing the intervention, this planning year, this 14-month period, was absolutely critical. What we did was we brought together 6 times for 2.5 days, 3 to 5 representatives from each of the 36 grantee programs, again, here in this room, to actually work through systematically a whole series of questions that have been anticipated by this discussion in terms of thinking about this particular intervention, the lifestyle balance curriculum, that was laid out in a particular format, content, delivery structure with the particular goals and objectives that are characteristic of it. But how do we make it their own? How do we actually, as David noted, you move from the one-on-one format to the group format. Well, what does that tend to do in terms of issues of fidelity for implementation? How can we think about capitalizing on some of the strengths in the Indian communities in which many of us are family-oriented? So we opened up the curriculum and the participation to key family members to participate. Imagine, if you will, what mom, who might be a participant in this program, was being taught how to eat and cook differently, and the reception she would get at home if her family hadn't been involved in that curriculum about her cooking for not only herself but everybody else in the family. And we're trying to anticipate those kinds of potential barriers. So we had numerous panels of the grantee staff involved over these many meetings to address issues of content, format, delivery, and duration. We settled on the notion of flexible uniformity. How do we achieve locally meaningful fidelity in terms of the translation of the key elements of this intervention into local application? The grantees were full participants in the evaluation design, which is really interesting because as a scientist, I had a particular mindset about some of the absolutely essential features. They went well beyond them. We ended up with a multi-level design, including not only the individual participants, the family members, the providers, the programs, and the community. It was really remarkable. And this particular year also underscored for us the importance of building capacity at the staff level because we anticipated and experienced a 30% turnover rate each year. And so how do you think about continuing to provide for the capacity that will carry beyond any one individual? What were the lessons learned? The lessons learned were really, I think, pretty straightforward for us. Everything has to be understood and rendered meaningful, rendered meaningful in local terms. Peer-to-peer learning is absolutely critical. David's point about not seeing a single patient or participant was absolutely true here. The only time in which I, for example, became personally involved in this is in January of 2007 when we bring all the grantees together. I made a public commitment to lose 110 pounds so that I walked the talk, and I did, following the same design. And I can't tell you how powerful that was, both in terms of the intervention on me, as well as being able to demonstrate that those of us who were leading it could, in fact, adhere to the basic principles that we were espousing. Peer-to-peer learning is really critical. You get talking heads up there, the experts. One woman said, what we don't need are more Indian experts. What we really need are more expert Indians. And so that's that notion, and there is this expertise at the local level. So the challenge is figuring out how to identify that expertise, how to identify local champions, how to support and promote them so that they become the ones that are actually transmitting the interventions itself. Compromise and negotiation are as much art as science. And lastly, success only precedes work in the dictionary. And there's absolutely no doubt that this was the hardest work I've ever done in my entire professional life. But it was really the challenge was how to bring forward indigenous gardens into the development of the cooking and the classes and the meal planning. How to bring forward, for example, classic traditional cultural activities such as canoeing and other kinds of things into improving the physical activity and engagement of the youth. How to use, for example, intergenerational activities, whether it be gardening or beadwork or basket making, to convey these lessons and to reinforce them in a variety of different ways. Those are the challenges that we experience. I'll end on the note that, in fact, as David experienced, we have 10,000 active participants in this intervention alone today. We have mirrored the 57% reduction in incident diabetes that they demonstrated in the original efficacy trial. We had 76% retention at the close of the 16-session lifestyle balanced curriculum. And that demonstrates, one, the power of this evidence-based practice, two, the ability to figure out how to make it locally meaningful, and three, as a consequence of that, how to capitalize on the creativity, the commitment, the enthusiasm, and the vision of the local populace. Thanks.